pole still clasped in his hand. A flat map case was slung by a strap about his neck, his thin envelope between his arms and his body as if for safekeeping. On a smooth flap was a survey seal, and it was fastened with a finger lock. Thorvald had lost some of the bright hard surface he had shown at the spaceport where Shann had first sighted him. There were hollows in his cheeks, sending into high relief those bone ridges beneath his eye sockets, giving him a faint resemblance to the skull of Shann's dream. His face was grimed, his field uniform stained and torn. Only his hair was as bright as ever. Shann smeared the back of his hand across his own face, not doubting that he must present an even more disreputable appearance. He leaned forward cautiously to look into the water, but that surface was not quiet enough to act as a mirror. Getting to his feet as the raft bobbed under his shift of weight, Shann studied the territory now about them. He could not match Thorvald's inches, just as he must have a third less bulk than the officer, but standing, he could sight something of what now lay beyond the rising banks of the cut. That grass which had been so thick in the meadowlands around the camp had thinned into separate clumps, pale lavender in color, and the scrawniness of stem and blade suggested dehydration and poor soil. The earth showing between those clumps was not of the usual blue, but pallid, too, bleached to gray, while the bushes along the stream's edge were few and smaller. They must have crossed the line into the desert Thorvald had promised. Shann edged around to face west. There was light enough in the sky to sight tall black pyramids waiting. They had to reach those distant mountains whose feet on the other side were resting in seawater. He studied them carefully, surveying each peak he could separate from its fellows. Did the skull lie among them? The conviction that the place he had seen in his dream was real, that it was to be found on Warlock, persisted. Not only was it a definite feature of the landscape somewhere in the wild places of this world, but it was also necessary for him to locate it. Why? Shann puzzled over that with a growing uneasiness which was not quite fear. Not yet, anyway. Thorvald moved. The raft tilted and the wolverines became growly. Shann sat down, one hand out to the officer's shoulder in warning. Feeling that touch, Thorvald shifted, one hand striking out blindly in a blow which Shann was just able to avoid, while with the other he pinned the map case yet tighter to him. "Take it easy," Shann urged. The other's eyelids flicked. He looked up, but not as if he saw Shann at all. "The cavern of the veil," he muttered. "Utgard." Then his eyes did focus, and he sat up, gazing around him with a frown. "We're in the desert," Shann announced. Thorvald got up, balancing on feet planted a little apart, looking to the faded expanse of the waste spreading from the river cut. He stared at the mountains before he squatted down to fumble with the lock of the map case. The wolverines were growing restless, though they still did not try to move about too freely on the raft, greeting Shann with vocal complaint. He and Thorvald could satisfy their hunger with a handful of concentrates from the survival kit, but those dry tablets could not serve the animals. Shann studied the terrain with more knowledge than he had possessed a week earlier. This was not hunting land, but there remained the bounty of the river. "We'll have to feed Taggi and Togi," he broke the silence abruptly. "If we don't, they'll be into the river and off on their own." Thorvald glanced up from one of the tough, thin sheets of map skin, again as if he had been drawn back from some distance. His eyes moved from Shann to the unpromising shore. How? With what? He wanted to know. Then the real urgency of the situation must have penetrated his mental isolation. "You have an idea?" "There's those fish we found them eating back by the mountain stream," Shann said, recalling an incident of a few days earlier. "Rocks here, too, like those the fish were hiding under. Maybe we can locate some of them here." He knew that Thorvald would be reluctant to work the raft inshore to spare time for such hunting, but there would be no arguing with hungry wolverines, and he did not propose to lose the animals for the officer's whim. However, Thorvald did not protest. They pulled the raft out of the main pull of the current, sending it in towards the southern shore in the lee of a clump of light willows. Shann scrambled ashore, the wolverines after him, sniffing along at his heels while he overturned likely-looking rocks to unroof some odd underwater dwellings. The fish with the rudimentary legs were present and not agile enough even in their native element to avoid well-clawed paws which scooped them neatly out of the river shallows. There was also a sleek furred creature with a broad flat head and paddle-equipped forepaws, rather like a miniature seal, which Taggi appropriated before Shann had a chance to examine it closely. In fact, the wolverines wrought havoc along a half-mile section of bank before the Terran could coax them back to the raft. As they hunted, Shann got a better idea of the land about the river. It was sere, the vegetation dwindling except for some rough spikes of things pushing through the parched ground like flayed fingers, their puffed redness in contrast to the usual amethystine coloring of Warlock's growing things. Under the climbing sun, that whole stretch of country was revealed in a stark bareness which at first repelled and then began to interest him. He discovered Thorvald standing on the upper bluff, looking out toward the waiting mountains. The officer turned as Shann urged the wolverines to the raft, and when he jumped down the drop to join them, Shann saw he carried a map strip unrolled in his hand. "The situation is not as good as we hoped," he told the younger man. "We will have to leave the river to cross the heights." "Why?" "There are rapids bending in a falls." The officer squatted down, spreading out the strip and making stabs at it with a nervous fingertip. "Here we have to leave. This is all rough ground, but lying to the south there's a gap which may be a pass." This was made from an aerial survey. Shann knew enough to realize to what extent such a guide could go wrong. Main features of the landscape would be clear enough from aloft, but there might be unsurmountable difficulties at ground level which were not distinguishable from the air. Yet Thorvald had planned this journey as if he had already explored their escape route, and that it was as open and easy as a stroll down Tyr's main transport way. Why was it so necessary that they try to reach the sea? However, since he had no objection to voice except a dislike for indefinite information, Shann did not question the other's calm assumption of command. Not yet, anyway. As they embarked and worked back into the current, Shann studied his companion. Thorvald had freely listed the difficulties lying before them, yet he did not seem in the least worried about their being able to win through to the sea. Or if he was, his outer shell of unconcern remained uncracked. Before their first day together had ended, the young Terran had learned that, to Thorvald, he was only another tool, to be used by the survey officer in some project which the other believed of primary importance. And his resentment of the evaluation was under control so far. He valued Thorvald's knowledge, but the other's attitude chilled and rebuffed his need for something more than a half-partnership of work. Why had Thorvald come back to Warlock in the first place? And why had it been necessary for him to risk his life? Perhaps more than his life, if their theory was correct concerning the Throg's wish to capture a Terran. To get that set of maps from the plundered camp? When he had first talked of that raid, his promised loot had been supplies to fill their daily needs. There had been no mention of maps. By all signs, Thorvald was engaged on some mission, and what would